We are witnessing America as a failed social experiment.
How do we tell this story in a way that builds the kind of emotional momentum that colorblind ideology builds?
So many young brothers and sisters of the younger generation find themselves so far removed from the best of their past.
What are we going to make out of the nothing we've been given? How do you envision possibility?
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to The Tightrope, where we take on tough issues, try to keep our balance, and always infuse our meaning and conversation with love and justice as much as we can. I am here with my dear friend and amazing co-host, Dr. Cornel West. Cornel, how are you doing today?
Oh, it's always a blessing and a joy to be in dialogue with you, my dear sister Tricia.
I'll tell you, 2020, we survived it, hanging out on the tightrope. That's how I feel.
Oh, indeed. What a year, though, but it's a blessing to make it through. Each day is a gift and each breath is a breakthrough.
As we look ahead, today we're going to talk with our tightrope community about a virtue, and we're going to talk amongst ourselves. We are each other's guests, and we're happy to talk. We always go on after episodes and keep talking anyway, so we thought we would just share that with you. And so today, Cornel and I are going to talk about the virtue courage. And so we're going to start off with your definition, Cornel, of courage. What is courage? Why should we care about it? Tell us how you think about courage as a virtue.
Well, I appreciate that. I think courage is a matter of mustering the will to look fear in the face and work through it, to look grimness in the face and still hope, to look ignorance in the face and still try to think critically, because we live in a moment of such massive conformity, massive complacency, that courage cuts so radically against the grain when you muster the will to courageously think for yourself, love for yourself, hope for yourself in relation to something bigger than you. And so I think to talk about a virtue like courage in a certain sense is not just timely and needful, but it can be subversive. It can change people's worlds and turn them upside down. It might even change society upside down. You get enough courageous people with courageous organizations.
Yes.
What would be your definition, you think, of courage?
Well, I mean, I couldn't really top that definition. You covered a lot of the things that I would immediately think of. For me, I guess, courage is very much taking the position no matter what level of popularity it has attached to it, because you're making a response and a decision to be courageous because of something bigger that is more important to you, that is not context specific, so that it's higher than the context you're in. It doesn't mean necessarily being challenging directly. It doesn't mean automatically being in a conflict or contest, although often you have to, kind of bring yourself up to handle what's going to come to you. But for me, I usually think about courage in relationship to standing up for other things, for other people, for people who are vulnerable, for animals, for poor people, for religious minorities, to consistently think about what it means to go against whatever the mainstream dominant ideas are that are harmful. Not every mainstream idea is harmful. Not every expression in the world in dominant society is something that one has to work against. But when it is, that's when courage, I think, shows up as a very important practice. And it is kind of, for me, it's a practice because it's if you don't deploy it, it becomes harder and harder to use because you get more mired in, as you put it, conformity, complacency, and complicity. And once you're all tangled up, it's very difficult to pull out some, some big guns of courage.
That's exactly right.
And, so that's often how it comes to mind. And the other thing is, when shame is produced around certain things, it's also very hard to have courage and to stand up against. And shame here, I'm thinking about when there's a movement in one direction where everyone is expecting you to respond a certain way, and that they'll be shocked and you'll be outcast or you'll be marginalized, or how could you say that? How could you come to that conclusion, or how could you challenge this conventional wisdom that we all deeply believe in? That's when, when saying it and being rejected because of it, produces a lot of shame, because what we want affirmation.
That's
and
right.
Courage and affirmation do not always go together. So those are some of the thoughts that I think are important about how I think about courage, at least.
I mean, oftentimes to talk about exemplars of courage gives us a sense of what courage really is. When people think of Socrates as an exemplar of courage, when he says parrhesia, the unintimidated speech, fearless speech, frank speech, that was the cause of my unpopularity. And I had to courageously take a stand over against the polis, over against Athenian democracy. And then he's condemned to death and drinks the hemlock and dies. So that courage to think for himself. So courage is tied to an integrity. In his case, it's an intellectual integrity. Or you think of Jesus going to the temple, the huge, the largest edifice on the other side of Rome, with the police on the one side, and it was a bank itself. It had so much of the wealth, and he runs the money changers out. When we think of that as being courageous, because he does it in the name of the poor, but it leads toward his arrest, conviction, crucifixion. But it's not so much a courage that exemplifies intellectual integrity, but it's really a moral integrity that he's working with in that way. Fannie Lou Hamer, in a way, brings both of them together.
Right.
She goes on national TV and right in the face of LBJ, Martin Luther King Jr., everybody says, I question America. Even Martin was wrong in terms of his attempt to maneuver to get the Democratic Party to adjust itself to the injustice in Mississippi in that case. She had to be critical of the great Martin Luther King Jr. I question America, but like Jesus, she does it out of a deep love for the poor. And therefore, as you say, is willing to be sacrificial, or at least her commitment would lead toward tremendous cost and tremendous risk. And these examples make a difference. And we have examples of movements, not just individuals as well, but they make a difference because in America, most of the talk about life and being human is about success.
Right.
And see, it doesn't take courage to be successful. You can be smart, you can be talented, you can be innovative, you can be creative, but that's not courage. You see, you haven't got really down to courage yet.
No.
And success is really all about, well, how will you become so well adjusted to injustice? How will you become so well adapted to the indifference once you get inside of the system and become only concerned about yourself, your career, your opportunities, rather than the plight of others? So courage is a challenge to that. And then something deeper than courage is fortitude. Fortitude, because if even folk with evil causes can be courageous.
That's true.
The Nazi soldiers, Ku Klux Klan, the army in South Africa crushing our Black brothers and sisters, that they can engage in war. I mean, the same Afrikaner army pushed out the British Empire.
Right.
And they could try to engage in vicious attacks on poor people and working people. But when you go to war and you're willing to die, that is a courageous act. Right. But when you have a good cause, you got courage plus something else. That's fortitude.
I see. Okay, that's very helpful. So I was using courage in a very a kind of romantic way, but it's important to realize that on all sides of conflict, or all sides of debate, or all sides of value systems in given society, you have courageous action and courageous engagement. So courage has to be tethered to an additional set of values. Is that right? In order
Exactly.
for us to really understand what's being courageous. So let me ask you a question about
Absolutely.
Socrates. How would we connect his story to the current debates about freedom of speech, right? This idea that must be free to say whatever they want, and that this idea that any guardrails, any challenges to the capacity of people to speak freely 100% of the time are, undermining this fundamental virtue. Now, of course, I believe in freedom of speech, but as our
Absolutely.
community of viewers and listeners knows, it's a very common issue right now for this to be a political battleground on many college campuses, right? That progressive people or people fighting for racial justice or, class justice or whatever they're organizing around, indigenous rights, trans and other sexual identity rights, that they're asking for some of the operations of the university to be mindful of the power structure and the hierarchy, and to not use words and ways of arguing that further reproduce the subordination of said groups. And on the other side is an often freedom of speech based defense, a principle based defense of all speech, but eventually you end up with people trying to prove that they should be able to use the N word whenever they want, because they're
That's right.
free to use whatever word they want. You know what I mean? Instead of saying, I want to speak about values in the world, which I'm all excited about, but they just want to come down to prove they can just insult people because they got the right. So how does this notion of courage in regard to Socrates and his dying for the right to speak freely attach itself to this freedom of speech type framework? Because I think there's some connection there. Am I right?
No, it's a wonderful question. It's a crucial question because, for Socrates, to engage in parrhesia, to engage in this fearless, unintimidated, frank, and free speech was always a matter of having a certain character. So it had nothing to do with the law. It had to do with the shaping of human beings, the shapings of souls, forms of soulcraft, such that human beings would choose to be the kind of persons who would never be intimidated, who would never be afraid, who would never be scared to speak their minds. Mm-hmm. Now, as exemplar of a certain kind of person in Athenian democracy, Socrates was vowed to the notion of never doing anything to commit harm to somebody, no matter what, because for him that's the spreading of evil, and the aim was always to attenuate or avoid evil, especially coming out of one's own actions and one's own deeds. Now, when you jump to the modern period, let's say like a John Stuart Mill or Catherine McKenna, for example, where Mill says, well, let's have a harm principle. So in On Liberty, 1859, he argues people have a right to be wrong. People have a right to say what they want to say as long as they don't engage in injurious harm. Mm-hmm. And we need a legal system to protect that. Now, see, Socrates wouldn't go that far. Now, of course, he's in pre-modern pagan Athenian conditions in that way. But then somebody like Catherine McKenna and others will say, but wait a minute, we noticed that this harm principle really doesn't apply to certain people, women, and people of color. Even John Stuart Mill had a footnote. Everything in this text applies to Europe, not India. Oh, I see, Brother Mill.
Thanks for that footnote. Very helpful.
Yeah, we appreciate that. Of course, he's a member of the East Indian Company. He got money in it and so forth and so on. Mm-hmm. And you need a Edmund Burke or somebody who was critical of that kind of corruption. Even though he's on the right wing in terms of the French Revolution, he's on the left wing in terms of his critique of British imperialism. So Catherine McKenna say was, when it comes to women, the harm principle actually is not just pushed aside, but harm is built into the very legal system that claims to be protecting free speech.
Right.
So you get a critique of the system in the ways in which it is tilted against certain people, and not certain people, but majority of humankind. Women, majority of humankind, third world at the time, majority of humankind, people of color, black folk, brown, and others. So you got these three different exemplars of how we talk about courage in relation to free speech. And usually, you know, the Socrateses and the Jesuses and the Fannie Lou Hamers, they are crushed by powers that be of their day, no matter what.
Right. I mean, that's an interesting point about harm being built into the system or into the language, into the infrastructure, into the policies and processes. Because, you know, it's particularly in terms of Western democracies' efforts to imagine that these processes are profoundly neutral. And as long as people follow you know, move along inside the system, the truth will emerge. Justice will prevail.
Because if you got forms of tear and trauma and stigma that are constitutive of the free system, then in the name of freedom, they're going to be reinforcing unfreedom,
right,
and unable to be self-critical of themselves. So in all of their arrogance and blindness and ignorance, because they can't even see the way in which sexual violence, violence against women is constitutive of the legal order until just a few decades ago.
And then a lot still don't see it.
And in many ways, they absolutely still don't see, even though with the feminist movement now stronger and so forth, you got some strong voices out there at least.
Right.
But, and the same would be true in regard to white supremacy.
Right.
Same would be true in regard to imperial sensibilities vis-a-vis indigenous peoples or other peoples, you see. And so the whole issue of courage then has to take on a more international, more cosmopolitan, more broad, more self-critical orientation.
Yeah.
And that's one of the critiques of this liberal talk about free speech. You see, people over and over again will talk about free speech when the voices are critical of them. But, you know, certain voices will go up. They're not going to say a mumbling word in defense of those voices.
You know, I noticed the free speech debates quieted down during the last couple of years. I didn't hear too many people defending Black Lives Matter and the right to free speech and protest. And, you know, it got pretty quiet on that front.
But you had the Harper's Magazine episode. You remember when they had the cancel culture and the firing of certain editors in the New York Times, and people were saying, wait a minute, their free speech is being violated. And I agreed with that. I think the liberals are right when they talk about calling for voices to be heard. But the problem with too many liberals is that, you know, they don't come to Mark Lamont Hill's defense.
Right.
When he raises his free speech and he's critical of one of their taboo issues in terms of Israeli occupation, not one of them will step forward. Now you get, you know, conservative brother like my dear brother Robert George. He was defending Mark Lamont Hill's right to speak. He disagreed with Mark deeply, but he defended his right. But see, most of the liberals, they won't even defend it right. He gets dismissed, canceled, fired from CNN. Nobody says a mumbling word for the most part in liberal circles. Because those of us who try to be consistent have to defend the brother.
Right. Well, because I think in many cases, it's about satisfying a political position that a powerful cohort, whoever it happens to be, wants repeated and affirmed. And that's true across the political spectrum. It seems to me. It's hard, true. You know, it's hard, but, you know, at the same time, you know, it's very difficult. And this is why this question of courage is so important, because, you know, I don't really want to spend my days defending the Ku Klux Klan's right to say hateful things in the middle of the doggone street. I'm too busy to use my precious time.
I understand.
But if someone were to ask me in principle, I'd be like, yeah, you know, and, you know, if someone, you know, so it's so much of it is about context and power, you know, because if we're going to invite inflammatory speakers, right, to campuses of any political spectrum, if it's going to produce harm, particularly to those who are more vulnerable, not, you know, even if it's the threat of harm or the language that would support harm in some way or narrative harm, I'm going to be concerned about that, even as I understand that there's a right to that speech. But let me ask you a question about.
But we should say something about the university context, because I think that is very different than the streets.
True.
For example, I mean, the Klan had the right to go to Charlottesville, and that's why many of us went to Charlottesville to oppose them. They have the right to raise their voices. They don't have the right to engage in injurious harm. They don't have the right to attack us. They don't have the right to trash us. And so when we're confronted with them face to face, I could see courage in these sick neo-fascist vanilla brothers. I could see deep courage. They came with their guns. They came with their masks. They had ammunition. That's courage. Just like a Nazi soldier got courage. They're just thugs, and they got vicious, evil causes. And we had to have courage to try to take a stand without the guns, right? But they have a right to raise their voices. What they didn't have a right to do was to harass, intimidate, kill Sister Heather. I mean, that's right. A crime against humanity and so forth. But universities are different, because universities, you got to have high quality voices. Exactly. So you don't just snatch anybody off the corner, you know what I mean? And say, they got a view about the earth, we think it's flat. No, you go on back to the barbershop and talk about how flat the earth looks to you. We got more sophisticated ways of talking about this since Copernicus at a university. So the university can't be a place.
There's a higher standard.
Well, there's exactly.
Right.
So that the right wingers have a right to raise their voices, bring the most sophisticated versions of your right wing views that I think for the most part are wrong, but I'll listen to. And we're gonna bring our left and the center and the liberal and so forth. So universities have to be a very special kind of place in the name of high quality engagement and Socratic dialogue. Right. And we hope, following the harm principle of Mill, that it's not going to spill over with injurious harm to people.
Right. So, what do you say to students who feel that hearing those positions, although, I'll just put high quality in quotes, because I mean, Lord knows what that entirely means.
Right, that's true.
In the specific nature of who we're talking about. I mean, Earth is flat, definitely not high quality. We just toss that right on out. We don't need to debate that. But, so if you say to students, look, I'm in a situation where I feel always under assault. I don't know when the police are going to come drag me out of my room or whatever their fears are about. And they say, look, I don't want to hear this position, right? What kind of argument can we make that would be compelling, you think, about why it's important to have that space and for us to weather which to many people feels it's automatically an injurious conversation, right? Arguments about Black people creating their own conditions entirely, that they're more criminal than other people, that the evidence shows they're less intelligent. People are still writing those books.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Genetic arguments, right? Over and over and over. It's increasing, it's not decreasing in institutional credibility. So there's freedom of speech, there's power to exercise that speech, there's curricular power to train people in ideas based on these principles. What do we say? How do we square your high quality multi-positionality debate and discussion model of campuses with the kinds of challenges that many students are making today?
I mean, one, we tell young people that university is an education for adults. But what I mean by for adults, it means that you're trying to come into a stage of maturity where you understand just how ugly, vicious, grim, hateful people can be. Right. And there is no safe space in the world for any escape from certain kinds of hate and domination and exploitation and lies and so forth. So don't think you're coming to a university to somehow escape the world's lies. I mean, oftentimes the university is the very source of the lies. They're the very rationalization of it. They're the very legitimation of it. So everywhere you go as an adult, you're being educated into how to come to terms with all the lies and crimes that surround your life. So you come into the university and you say that I am getting fortified to be able to deal with whatever kinds of lies and crimes and rationalizations and legitimations and critiques of those. So that, for example, when Shockley used to show up at Princeton in the 1970s as a graduate student, we had an inside-outside strategy, right? We had a massive protest outside and said, this brother is spreading some of the most vicious white supremacist lies that's been around for hundreds of years. Then we had folk on the inside who were scientific, Howard Taylor and the other people in psychology, who could argue against Shockley inside of the room, showing how what we were saying outside was true, that we had the evidence. We had the best arguments and so forth. But what we didn't do, we didn't prevent Shockley from coming. We didn't suppress him once he got here. Why? Because that would make people think Shockley somehow was some isolated individual and he the only one that lied. No, and we keep track of all the lies that led into Princeton or Harvard or Yale or Brown, you'd have to shut the jokers down.
Yeah, exactly. You have an archive the size of the Smithsonian, you know.
Exactly. And in all honesty, if we had to come to terms with all the lies inside of us,
true,
we'd had to shut a whole lot of our own lies down. Because
yeah, that's true. So do you think that there is a certain kind of courage that we would encourage our students and even faculty, to embody in the face of, right? Because when you say a certain kind of maturity, the first thing that came to mind was, well, are we saying that, the focus on the painful confrontation with this kind of ideology and practice is something that we should have to weather, right? And if it is, but your point is it's everywhere, which means you gotta weather.
Exactly, that's what it is to grow up.
But I guess for me, it's sort of, I guess imagining, just to create an imaginary moment. Say you're in a young woman in a big STEM lecture hall. You're the only sister in there. You got 300 men. And the teacher cracks some kind of sexist joke, right? Now, of course, it could be a Title IX problem, so then,
right.
So then we got laws for that. Sometimes the laws help. Or let's just say that the climate in there is such that there's all kinds of assumptions being made about gender in the curriculum and in the socialization of it. So now I'm going to be hard pressed, Cornel, to tell this young woman that this is the world's an ugly place. And you just going to have, actually, let me revise that. Let me take that. Because actually in private, I would say that. I would say, look, this is an effed up universe.
It's a university and universe at crucial moments. There's other crucial moments when the universe is beautiful, other moments when the university can be very positive.
Right. But I would also pressure that social space to be more accountable.
Absolutely.
Creating an environment in which all people can learn and advance themselves intellectually and grow and develop as they have the right to. So,
absolutely. And that's where the accountability and the pressure comes. You say, Professor, I'm not putting up with this kind of racist and sexist gesturing. I see a pattern and that we need to sit down and talk, that we need to talk to administration. The president makes sure that this is a space where people are respected. Now, respected is different than the kind of safe space, though, you see, because when you're respected, it means that people are making an effort to stay in contact with humanity, but everybody's making an effort. There's always going to be moments in which they fall short.
Right.
And when they do fall short, the accountability sets in. Now, my example was, the mass protests outside against Shockley and the intellectual pressure on the inside with the counter arguments against him. You see. But what part of our problem though is that when you have a university that's a neoliberal university, which means that it more and more views itself as providing a product to consumers rather than providing wisdom and knowledge to young people in the process of becoming mature and courageous and visionary. And once you have a market model, then of course everybody wants safety. They want satisfaction. They want to be in a space that they feel as if they have their own contentment. And you say, well, no, education is not about contentment. It's about discontent. It's about dissatisfaction. Right. It's about unsettling. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's ought to be true across the board.
Right.
All of us ought to be in some sense unsettled.
Yeah. I see what you're saying. So the courage is really about demanding respect in the context of a kind of mutual understanding that we're all striving for that kind of respect, but we don't expect it to be permanent and perfect.
That's right.
But we take away the language of safety. This is interesting. It's interesting.
And yet you have the courage to take a stand when you do feel offended. I mean, when one is offended and disrespected, the last thing you want to do is be complicitous with that.
Right.
You see, but that doesn't take the form of trying to make sure people don't speak or suppressing speech and so forth. It takes the form of creating countervailing spaces so that, what you and I did in college, right? That we created our own countervailing spaces where we could have contexts in which our respect was real, our humanity was affirmed. Then we got fortified, go right back into mainstream Yale College, mainstream whatever it is, Harvard, Brown, whatever it is, Howard, Spelman, Berkeley.
I think you're really, this really have connected something, I think, very important in my mind, the pieces that weren't quite together, because a neoliberal context as a market means that you're purchasing something. And so when you have conflict and pain and suffering and insult or insecurity, then it's a bad product. It's a defective product.
That's exactly right.
You're like, man, look, I didn't buy this yoga.
That's a beautiful way of putting it.
It's a beautiful way of putting it. Yeah, it's a defective product. So then you want to be outraged. You're like, man, look, I didn't put all this money, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 down, or whatever percentage I can afford.
Advertising that I'm going to be able to gain access to this, all of this satisfaction, and so.
Right. But see, I mean, not only, do I think there's a generational difference in terms of the experience that people have, but I had no sense when I was at Yale, and you and I overlapped there. You were a professor there for a little bit of time. I was there as a student. I had no sense that thing belonged to me.
Yeah.
No expectation. Zero. I was like, yo, I'm just gonna go get what I can get out of this spot and get out.
And you turn out to be one of the most distinguished folk to go through that place of your generation. That's a beautiful thing. But it's true. I mean, each historical moment is going to be a different one, so that the commodification had not so thoroughly saturated every nook and cranny of the university and culture the way it does our precious young folk today.
And I think so many things have come together here in the conversation, because, in that era, right, I know I certainly was raised in the context of a pretty much a presumed segregated consciousness, like affirmative action, civil rights movement created this space, go get what you can get, don't have any expectations. They didn't build this thing for you.
That's right.
You can do and get out. Now, over time, the combination of a market economy, right, the combination of greater expectations of access, which is a good thing, right? With continued violence and continued disrespect and continued, insult, right, around your fundamental capacity as a human being, for Black people, for women, so on and so forth, is a cauldron of complexity, right? It's a different moment to live in the space that you're trying to encourage people to perceive the university to be for, because it's already a market, and they're like, look, I need to get this degree to get this next degree to get this next degree so I can go off and be successful, where we started the conversation.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
And you put all those pieces together, it's no wonder it's kind of a hot mess in terms of how to help people. And then the social media, the constant repetition of violence against us and other groups of people in just a looped phenomenon.
Over and over again.
I mean, this is not good for the psyche. I mean,
That's very real.
Shrink, but
that's very real. I think what you're talking about in terms of these different processes that are intertwined and entangled, because what happened was you had three to happen at the same time. You got the democratization of the university in terms of expanding beyond, especially elite universities, beyond the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, that democratization went hand in hand with the commodification of the university in terms of the role that big money would more and more play, but big money much more tied to the financialization, the Wall Streets and the Silicon Valleys and so forth.
The industry, the focus on big industry.
And with the government giving big money tied to STEM programs, the government's not giving big money to how to read the poetry of Pindar or Gwendolyn Brooks. You know what I mean?
Not exactly.
They tied to the STEM programs.
Right.
So that the students more and more shifting toward computer science and engineering, because that's where the money's going to be when they graduate. But then the other level is a kind of a leveling that takes place. It's a kind of dumbing down that takes place too, so that the connection between the best of the past, the role of history, is more and more pushed aside. Because as you get a commodified university, commodified culture of students, it's just can't wait to get that job, can't wait to get that status, can't wait to get this money. And so you don't need a whole lot of history. You don't need a whole lot of connection with
the best. It's in the way, actually.
It can be impediments. And see, there's some good things about each one of those. I mean, democratization is very important. You get these books now by our dear brother Michael Sandel, The Tyranny of Merit. And it's important work. The Cult of Smart, of Brother Du Bois' book, or The Tyranny of Virtue, of Brother Robert Boyer's book. I mean, all of these texts are trying to keep track of these processes of commodification, of democratization, and of dumbing down or leveling that takes place.
Right, right.
It's a mess. It is a mess.
Yeah, it's much more complicated. So why is courage, I mean, assuming that we're, gathering up the pieces of the conversation around, Socrates, right? The courage to challenge, say, white supremacists in Charlottesville and elsewhere, the courage to challenge in a university, right? The dominant group whose investment is to bring people who say hateful things with footnotes.
Right. That's right. A whole lot of footnotes, hide and conceal a whole lot of crimes taking place.
Exactly. Right. You start peeling back the footnote, you just got crimes, bars, and all kinds.
All that blood starts.
Yes, indeed.
Bubbling over.
So you put all those pieces together, and it seems that courage is a necessary weapon, or no, I don't want to turn everything into a war, but a necessary piece of your resources, right? Your tools in your toolkit. But why is that not fearlessness? Because, it seems that that all of these conditions would produce a significant amount of fear, or at least some of it. So why is courage either distinct from or different from fearlessness?
Yeah, well, that's a wonderful question. I mean, Aristotle wrestles with this in Nicomachean Ethics. But when you think of our examples, though, intellectual courage, let's say Socrates, we could say the same thing about Nietzsche. Whether you agree or disagree with their conclusions, they exemplify that. Jesus in the temple, moral and spiritual courage in that regard. A political courage would be joining a movement, joining a organization that's trying to authorize a better future. See, fearlessness itself is something to cultivate, but it doesn't have the sustaining power of a long-range habit that's tied to an alternative world, that's tied to a better world, that's tied to a vision that informs how we can get from where we are to where we ought to be. You see? So that now fortitude means the conception of the vision has rich moral qualities to it. Because I mean, you know, Nazis are trying to create an alternative. It's just a vicious, more barbaric alternative than let's say the liberal order, right? So that so again, courage has this kind of ideological promiscuity. It can lie with any cause, but when you start ranking the causes, the difference between empowering everyday people versus trashing everyday people and so on. But fearlessness, I think it just doesn't have the long sustaining power as a habit that allows persons to actually envision an alternative. So it's more reactive. I mean, it's almost, it's like a parasite on a host. You know what I mean? So no matter how much transgression a parasite has, it's still predicated and grounded in the host.
Interesting.
Whereas if you are responding to the host and you got a counter host, it's like being a black person. If I'm just reacting to white supremacy all my life, then I'm just a parasite on a host, no matter how successful I am. No matter how successful I am. But when I got a counter vision, then I got a tradition that I can fall back on that allows me to be more creative, allows me to be more compassionate, actually. Then you've got something different than just being a parasite on a host. You got a whole counter host. You have an alternative to the host.
Right. And that doesn't mean, let's unpack that for a minute, because you know, that's a complex idea to me, you know, a parasite on a host. So if you as a black man are basically only understanding yourself in direct and constant relationship to white supremacy, then you are, in a sense, dependent, as a parasite is, on its host, white supremacy. Because
Absolutely.
you can't live without it. You don't exist without it.
And that becomes your point of reference all the time.
It's your sustenance, ultimately, right? Is what you're saying really for a parasite, right?
That's true. That's true.
So in this case, what you're saying is that in order now you're not saying that if you were also instead to have this full range of traditions and experiences and perceptions and values that are distinct from a white supremacist set of structures, you're not saying there's no overlap. You're not saying there's nothing that these two can.
Because you still have a critique and indictment of the host, a critique and indictment of white supremacy. Absolutely.
I mean, overall, not the white supremacy part, but some pieces of that puzzle. So you're just saying the relationship would be wholly different. It's not completely opposite, and it's not that you're saying they cannot be relational, but they're not relational in the way that a parasite is related to a host. I think this is very interesting because it basically says, you know, you on the one hand have to be deeply aware of these structures. It could be sexism, it could be patriarchy, it could be racism, right? And you have to manage and attend to the realities of that situation. But if you defined yourself solely in relationship to it, you are basically consigning yourself to nothingness or a lack of complete independence. You have nothing you can rely on but whatever it is they're about to give you.
That's exactly right.
And
it's like when Mary Lou Williams' jazz orchestra steps into the club, they are essentially saying that we might be using European instruments, but we're not parasites on European music.
Exactly.
You see, so we are conversant with, we are interacting with the music, we are using a piano and a saxophone created in Europe, but we have a counter host. We got something outside of the white point of reference. We got something outside the normative white gaze. We got something outside of white supremacy, even though we are indicting white supremacy. That's not our point of reference.
Right.
We're talking about truth, beauty as it's manifest in these beautiful New World Africans, these beautiful Black folk. So no matter how Jim Crowed and enslaved they are, listen to all this truth and beauty, even though we're going to be using, you know,
The instruments, right?
Instrument created by Adolphe Sax in Belgium in 1848 called saxophone.
Exactly. And we're not even going to follow the rules of musical construction.
That's right.
Right? We may use the tools, but not the handbook that came with the tool.
That's exactly right.
We'll
That's
find another
exactly
handbook.
right.
Yeah. No, this is really interesting. So is this a time, Cornel, that we need much more courage than some other times? Or do you think that we're up for this task? Because, it seems like a time when we need to really stand up for a lot of things. And it could be in some ways harder to be courageous in 2021 than it was in 2020. Because of the things you're saying about this. You see what I'm saying? Go ahead, talk to me.
In every generation, it's hard to find courageous folk because folk oftentimes are just so frustrated, they're so fearful that they'd rather just either cowardly submit or strategically adapt rather than courageously bear witness. This is true for every generation. The problem these days, our biggest problem is, you see, in a market culture, there's a lot of false examples of courage. They're semblances. They are simulacra. So they act as if it's a posing and posturing of courage. You get this among a lot of liberals and neoliberals. They walk around acting like they Malcolm X, and everybody know they ain't got hardly a Malcolm X body, a bone in their body. Because all you got to do is dangle a little money and carrots and status, and they'll give in like a moment in a second. That's not Fannie Lou. That's not Malcolm. So that in that sense, people feel as if they can have a spectacle of courage rather than a substance of genuine courage. You see? All of the simulacra and the semblances and the false versions of courage circulate. So young people begin to think, oh my God, that's an example of a tremendously courageous person. Then they point out some milquetoast politician.
Lord have mercy.
Wait.
Or, I often say to people, if you find some uncontroversial issue and take a stand, don't call me. You know what I mean? Don't call me. It's going to basically say people should be able to stand upright and their spines should be straight. Okay, well, there's no debate about that. There's no two sides to that discussion. Now, you want to talk about abortion? You want to talk about, increasing the minimum wage for all people or guaranteed income, or you want to talk about reparations, you want to talk about affirmative action, you want to talk about, you want to talk about, homophobia and its relationship to some interpretations of Christianity and the Bible. Now you're dealing with something else.
Then you got anytime you have the taboo issues that connect to the basic structure of a society.
Right. That's where the conflict. But let me challenge this a little. Yeah, that's when you got trouble. But let me say this: what happens though? Because we want to encourage everybody to be courageous. We don't want to send them off off a cliff. Early in January. We'll let them make people. Let's get through 2021. So. Is it something you have to deploy every time you have a battle? Do you have to go all out every time you see something? Because from my vantage point, I feel like one could spend all day taking courageous positions and acting courageously at a level that could make you unable to function. Now, I understand you don't want to be well-adjusted to injustice, but at the same time, you have a right to live.
Right? Absolutely.
So how, what do you say to people? Do you pick your battles? Do you choose to be strategic, or do you pick certain issues? Do you lay in the cut until there's a certain moment where you break for, I'm really, this is a strategy question, not a principle question. I guess it ends up being a principle question too, but you see what I'm asking?
But it's a crucial one because
they have options,
And the important thing here is that there is an indivisibility of the virtues. You can never take one virtue and fetishize it and isolate it and act and talk about it independent of its relation to the other virtues. Now, wisdom is another virtue. So you got to have courage and wisdom. Love is another virtue. You got to have courage and love. So if you're loving your child and you want to be courageous every night hitting the streets, it's not going to work. Your child needs attention.
Right.
So you have to have a life that has a life focused on virtues. And those virtues have to be able to be connected in such a way that you can be fortified long enough in order to fructify, in order for your deeds and your actions to leave a little heaven behind in terms of a blow. Because and leaving heaven behind means creating hell in the name of those who suffer, in the name of the wretched of the earth.
Right.
And so if all you're going to be is just courageous, then you're going to run out of gas because you don't have any connection to wisdom, no connection to love, no connection to other virtues that must be operating within a well-lived life. So that your question is a very important one, especially for our beloved audience. That see, we're not talking about just act as if this is courageous, capital C, and all the other virtues collapse.
Right, right. Or as in the
Mom,
early.
You're gonna need a little peanut butter and jelly. You're gonna need some peanut butter and jelly. Now, is it courageous for me to eat peanut butter and jelly? No, it just never disappoints. It just never disappoints.
And there's nothing wrong with that.
Nothing wrong with that.
Nothing wrong with that.
I ain't gonna have no stomach problems. You know what I mean? Ain't gonna have no biological process problems at all. It's just that I'm not getting enough vegetables.
Conflict in your digestive tract.
Not getting enough vegetables, you know. So I said, okay, I need to get me some broccoli and things. So, but so it is with the virtues. You have to be able to coordinate them in such a way. Aristotle called it the unity. I don't like to call it unity of the virtues. I like to call it the antagonistic cooperation, the jazz-like cooperation of the virtues themselves and how they overlap in that way.
Yeah. You know, to borrow a phrase from Dave Chappelle, you know, when keeping it real goes wrong, right? He had this amazing skit early in his first Chappelle show where this.
Ooh, that brother's a genius. He's a genius.
Yeah, isn't he? He shows up at his job and, you know, he's like speaking the truth and he's acting a fool, right? But we all know he's going to get fired in about 3 minutes. The skit's going, when keeping it real goes wrong. It's like, sometimes it's not the right time to tell the whole truth.
Sometimes it's just not the right time. But there's other times when you get pushed so far.
Right. You know, you got to come out
about your mama and think they can get away with it. Bump this job.
Right. That's right. But see, that's the question, right? When is it time for A and when is it time for B?
That's why that's where wisdom kicks in.
Right. And maybe we'll do another episode on wisdom because the question is also where do you get the tools to discern those things? I mean, you know, it's not like there's a handbook on how many insults you take before you quit. You have to, it's all these characteristics. Is your child starving? You know, does your partner need medical care that is urgent for life saving? You'd be like, well, I'm gonna take this foolishness. But then when does that ever end? At what point does it end? If it's a life, you know, there's a lot of circumstances. Or can you do some good? You know, and what good can you do? And is it worth it to do no good where you are? Because of principle, right? So, I mean, it feels complicated. It's no longer simply a matter of, you know, radical versus selling out. You know, it's a much more complicated terrain.
So many different possibilities and modalities between. There is such a thing as selling out. We know some folk who sell out. We know some folk who are sold in so much that they don't have time to live. So you can become a freedom fighter every minute of the day.
Yeah.
It never have time to live a life other than just doing that. And you say to yourself, well, for most of us, we want some practical wisdom. We want a way of being able to have some balance, but we don't want the balance to become a rationalization of being well adjusted to the injustice again.
Right. And this is very helpful because, you know, especially, you know, as you know, I mean, when you study or address racism or you address racialized human suffering, you know, is an exhaustion factor, you know.
Oh, absolutely.
Because as you well know, you get the same, you see the the failures of the world coming back at you in the form of innocent questions, right, in quotes,
Right. Right.
all day, all night. And everybody wants to be treated as if their innocent question is worthy of complete care and protection, you know? And to some degree, it's our responsibility, in my opinion, to treat people with that level of concern, because that's where they are and they're not
Oh, absolutely.
personally
Absolutely.
responsible. But
Absolutely.
the exhaustion factor of the thing is crazy.
Yeah.
So thinking
Yeah.
about when to be courageous, when to push, when to say no, when to really, you know, or, you know, to borrow another popular phrase, you know when to fold them, you know when to hold, you know when to fold. You just got to know
Mhm.
when it's the
Mhm.
right time, but that requires some more virtues. So I think we should do another episode on wisdom.
Oh, that sounds good to me.
I think that's
We
what
may just end up focusing every once in a while on a serious wrestling with a form of virtue that can
right.
sustain folk in 2021 with
Excellent.
smile, style, substance, and love.
I couldn't agree with you more. And we will end it on that note, Cornel, because that is a beautiful, beautiful possibility. We're gonna shoot for that. Thank you, everybody, for joining us on the tightrope. I had a great time today.
I had a magnificent time, like I always do. Like
Yeah,
I
that's true.
always
We always have a good time. I'm saying that like it's new. That ain't new.
No.
I'm saying it like it's the first time we had a good time. It doesn't make any sense. Anyway, it's
Always
wonderful
do.
to see you and to talk with you. And I want to thank everybody who's out and part of our tightrope community. Please join us, share if you like it, subscribe, and, you know, just be a part and let us know what you like, what you don't like. And we look forward to seeing you, I hope, the next time on the tightrope. Okay, Cornel, you have a good night now, okay?
All right, my dear Sister Tricia.